Belts. What the heck are belts? What do we use belts for? Well, belts are used to transfer force from a motor to a fan or blower or pump or some other device. And we connect the motor to that device using a belt, but then also pulleys or shivs. We're going to concentrate in this video on belts. Sometimes it can be a little bit confusing as to what do these numbers mean when we talk about belts. So we're going to go through some of that and hopefully get over some of that confusion. So now when we put a belt to a motor, we have to attach it to that motor using a pulley. And then there are different size pulleys. And by the combinations of those pulleys, we can have an impact on the speed of that device we're operating with the belt, or we can have an effect on the power that is applied to that device. So let's look at belts. Let's look at some specifics. How do I replace a belt that is worn out? Now, I'm going to look at two things. First, we're going to look at replacing a worn out belt. But then you may have to select a belt for an application where maybe the belt has blown up. It's completely destroyed and you can't get measurements on it. So first of all, we've got a belt and we want to try and replace it. First thing we want to do is make sure we have the correct length of belt. Now, if we look at this particular belt, it's identified as an A47. And the 47 refers to the length of the belt. We'll talk about what that A means in just a little bit. So now let's say that this was the bad belt. This is the belt that I'm replacing. How can I get a good measurement on that? And one thing you have to remember about the belt, after they've been operating for a while, it's possible that that size could be a little bit larger on the bad belt and that it stretches out over time. From force and also from heat, we could see that that might be a little bit longer today than when it was new. Now, I'm going to measure this belt, and I'm going to measure that using a tape measure. Oh, wait a second. This tape measure, it's not real flexible. I'm not sure if I can get a good measurement of this belt. Well, I am going to use the tape measurement, but I'm going to use something else in addition to the tape to get the measurement of this. Now, I've got a piece of rope. You could use a piece of string to do the same thing, but what I want to do is get a measurement of the belt itself, and it's curved, so that's, because this is a little non-flexible, going to be difficult. Now, when I take this measurement, keep in mind, if I were to measure the outer edge of this belt versus the inner edge of the belt, there's going to be a difference in that measurement. And that outer measurement would be longer than what the inner measurement is. Now again, this belt is called an A47. That's the inside measurement on this belt. Now to get the inside measurement, I'm just going to take this string around my belt and that string is going to cover the length, the inside length of this belt. So I'm taking that to right there. Now if I take this and put this on my tape measure, and this is a little easier to measure than the belt itself, I see that measures 47 inches. So the inside of that belt is 47 inches. If I were to measure the outer edge of that belt, I'd come up with a different measurement. So that gives me the length of my belt. Now, something else that I want to know about the belt, what is the width of the belt? Now, why would that be important, knowing the width of the belt? Because on different pulleys, that width may not allow that belt to operate where it's supposed to operate in the pulley. If that pulley is too wide, then the bottom of my belt will bottom out, and this could be loose in there. I may not be able to get operation of this without this belt slipping. So I want to make sure I have the proper width of the belt as well, which is easy to come up with. If I were to take my tape measure and just measure across the top of this, this would give me the width of the belt. So I've got the length and I've got the width of the belt. Now, when I start looking in catalogs at the replacements on belts, it'll show me what the length is. Now, in this slide, it shows pitch length. Well, what do they mean by pitch length? And the pitch length has to do with where this belt rides predominantly in the pulley. With the pitch, at that point, the measurement of that point, I would not see a difference in the length of the belt when it's operating. Now, what does that imply? All my stress is going to be right there about the pitch. And based upon how this belt is constructed, with the cords and the wrap that we have on these belts, that pitch is going to be essentially the center of all the force on this. So that's probably not an important consideration if you're replacing a belt that's been in application. But when you're trying to come up with the measurement of the belt when you don't have the old belt and you have to take measurements through the pulleys, then that pitch length can become pretty important in trying to decide what it is. Now, the pitch length, I can use that to determine the length of the belt. And this particular formula helps me to determine, well, what would the length of the belt be if I only know the distance between these pulleys? So you can determine what the belt length would be. And it's not an easy determination because you have to take into account angles, arcs on these belts because of the curve that we would see in the pulley and the belt when it's installed. So we look at that pitch length, we look at the center distance between the pulleys, but then we look at something called a datum or a pitch diameter. And that would be the point where my center part of this belt is riding in my pulley. So that gets a little more complex. If all I need to do is replace the belt, I don't need to worry about this formula. Now, we talked about the belt widths, and that's key when we're selecting replacement belts. So if we look at this graphic, it shows 3 different types of belts. One of the belts is called FHP. Those are typically lighter duty belts. I don't have as much load that I'm trying to move. FHP, fractional horsepower. And if we look at the numbers, these numbers are identified by 3L, 4L, and 5L. Now the difference would be the 3, 3/8 width, 4 1/2-inch width, 5 21/32 inch. So it has to do with the width of the belt. And typically we look at these dimensions in 1/8 of an inch. Now, the belt that is generally used in our industry can handle more load is what's called the classical belt. The classical belts are identified as A belts, B belts, or C belts. Those also then are in inches. The width, 1/2-inch, 21/32, or 7/8 of an inch. The second number on this shows the depth of the belt. And that depth of the belt is important so the belt doesn't bottom out on the pulley when it's riding in the pulley. Now the third belt is called a 358. 358. That's because these dimensions also are in 1/8 of an inch, but a 3V is 3/8 of an inch, a 5V is 5/8 of an inch, and an 8V is 8/8 or 1 inch in width. So if we understand those numbers, that helps us to really feel a little bit more comfortable about what are these belts? Why do they have these odd numbers associated with them? But they refer to the widths on the belt. Now, there are also belts that aren't smooth like this. This is just a wrapped belt. But then we have some belts that have cogs in them. And those cogs make it easier or less stress on the belt when I'm going around that bend. These are much easier to turn through a pulley than the flat belt. So the cog belts not only reduce the stress on the belt when it's operating, also gives me more grip on that pulley as it's operating. So these cog belts or notched belts make my device a little bit more efficient by having that. Now, there's another belt, and this is called a grip twist belt, and that sure looks strange. But the grip twist belt is a belt that can give me the option of sizing this to the length that I need. So if we were to look at the configuration of this belt, you can see that there are notches, there are holes and notches in this belt, and I can make this belt smaller or longer just by removing or adding a notch into it. So this particular belt, if I want to make it shorter, I can loosen, remove one of these sections, and as I remove the sections, it will allow me to make this the size that I want. So there are a lot of options in belts, and depending upon what you're trying to accomplish will determine the type of belt that you use. If we're looking for long life, if we're looking for high efficiency, we might want to use something like the cog belt. So keep these characteristics in mind as you're selecting your belts. And I hope it clarifies it just a little bit more for you so you're not wondering, what the heck are all of these numbers when I look at a part number on a belt? Thanks for being with us today.